Welcome to Semantic Backup Exec 2012 Agent for Microsoft SharePoint Server. If you're following along in the materials, we're in Lesson 5. In this lesson, we'll take an overview of SharePoint in general. We'll explain the basic concepts of SharePoint, and we'll describe the basic capabilities of the Backup Exec agent for Microsoft SharePoint. Then we'll take a look at the process needed to back up SharePoint and see the individual SharePoint resources. And then we'll go through doing restores of SharePoint. SharePoint allows you to do granular restores, so you can restore individual items, and we'll take a look at how to do that. So let's start with an overview of the SharePoint agent. SharePoint allows you to share resources between users. You can share documents, you can put up web pages for discussion boards, you can have weblogs or blogs, you can publish surveys, you can publish content so that it has limited or locked down usage, meaning you'd have to check it out to edit it, but you could just download it to read. So you can manage how the content is published. You can manage the records inside of SharePoint. SharePoint runs on a SQL server, a group of SQL databases. It uses ASP.NET, serviced by IIS. So it's very common to have SharePoint installed in a configuration known as a farm, in which you have an IIS server, you have a SQL server, and you have another server that is housing the items being shared, the doc files and PPTs and all of that's being shared. The Backup Exec agent for SharePoint allows you to back up the entire SharePoint farm and all the pieces of SharePoint regardless of where they're located. SharePoint terminology has changed depending on the version of SharePoint in use. You see here the different terminology. The Backup Exec agent for SharePoint does support all the versions that you see here, SharePoint 2003, 2007, and 2010. So just to get you familiar with the terminology, I tend to use the SharePoint 2010 terminology, so take that into consideration as we go through. The Backup Exec agent for Microsoft SharePoint is a licensed add-on to Backup Exec. You have to purchase it in addition to the core product, and it enables you to do granular recovery of all the SharePoint pieces. So it integrates all of your SharePoint backups with other network backups, and you don't have to have any separate administration or any separate hardware. It looks at the SQL databases for SharePoint as if they were just standalone SQL. So it handles all of the SQL transaction logs and databases automatically as part of this agent. When you purchase the agent for applications and databases and you intend to use it for SharePoint, it includes a SharePoint agent, a SQL agent for the SharePoint databases. If other databases are on a SQL server besides the SharePoint databases, you should also have the SQL agent to support those other databases. This agent that includes SharePoint allows you to back up the SharePoint related SQL databases regardless of where they're installed. It also includes one agent for Windows. Keep in mind that SharePoint is a distributed installation and may be installed on several machines. So you may need additional agents to be able to back up all the pieces of SharePoint. An agent for Windows needs to be on any SharePoint server that is housing any of the pieces of SharePoint. So it supports one SharePoint farm installation. It supports the SQL databases that are related to SharePoint, and it gives you one agent to put on one SharePoint server, although you may have more. You see here the versions of SharePoint that are supported. So Backup Exec will support any of the more current versions of SharePoint. The agent requires that you have a licensed agent for Windows on all the SharePoint servers and on the SQL server that is housing the SQL databases. As far as permissions, you must have local administrator rights on all the servers in the farm to be able to install the Backup Exec agent for Windows. It is certainly an advantage if it is part of, if your user account that you're using to back up SharePoint is a part of the SharePoint Farm Administrators group. It certainly makes restores easier. This account must also be a site collection administrator at the top level site if you wish to do GRT-based restores. And this account must have DB Data Owner, SQL admin role for all the SQL content, all the SQL databases. The logon credentials for the single sign-on database must have the account name or must be a member of the account group that's authorized to manage settings. So this goes back to that SharePoint Farm Administrators group. It is certainly an advantage if the logon credentials for the single sign-on database are also a member of that administrators group. And the logon account must be able to access the IIS sites, which should be integrated within Windows Security. To install the agent for SharePoint, you simply install it the way you do any other agent. You're installing the agent for applications and databases, and this would require a license for the agent for SharePoint. To back up SharePoint, you need to know what resources need to be backed up. Backup Exec will automatically find all of the SharePoint servers in the farm, and if you simply mark those servers with a checkbox at the highest level possible, you'll automatically have any SharePoint resources that are associated with that farm and any new resources that come in after you configure the job. But it is important to know what you're backing up. So what you see here are the resources for Server 2003. And we also let you know what SharePoint resources are available for SharePoint Server 2007. You'll notice the configuration database and the content database. These remain constant across the versions of SharePoint. These databases are a little more finicky about restores and redirecting restores. We'll take a look at that later. So the SharePoint resources for SharePoint 2007 also include the web application or the website and the single sign-on database that stores all the account information. For SharePoint 2010, again, we see the configuration database. You have many more granular settings in SharePoint 2010 than we've seen in prior versions. Shared services are the applications for the farm. These are the services that know where all the pieces and parts are. You have more services for SharePoint 2010 than you do the other versions. So if I want to add a server farm to the Backup Exec selection list, I go to the Backup and Restore tab. In the Servers group, click Add, and then when the wizard comes up, you need to tell it that you're going to add the Microsoft SharePoint Server Farm. It will ask you if you want to establish a trust. You must allow the trust for the agent to be installed. This is the Backup Exec trust between the agent and the Backup Exec server. When it asks you which SharePoint farm you want to add, a best practice here is to point this wizard at the web server, the SharePoint server that's running IIS. If you put the web server name in this field, then Backup Exec can query SharePoint and automatically find all the other servers in the SharePoint farm. So putting in the web server here is to your advantage. You can give the server farm any name you wish and give the farm a description if you choose to. The agent for Windows must be installed on any server that's in the farm so that you can back up that data. And then you need to provide the logon account that has credentials to access SharePoint. It should be a member of the SharePoint Farm Administrators group. It also needs to be able to access IIS and SQL. You have several different backup options for Microsoft SharePoint using Backup Exec. You can do block level database differential support using Volume Shadow Copy Service or VSS. We can also do block level incremental database support. In this version of Backup Exec, we have eliminated the transaction log backups. It is a best practice for SharePoint to have SQL configured to be in the simple recovery mode. Simple recovery mode means that there are limited number of transactions in the transaction log. So Backup Exec will tell you when you try to back up your SharePoint database, if your database is not in simple mode, it will pop up a message that says this database should be configured in simple mode for SQL. So let's take a look at what we're backing up when we look at our backup jobs for SharePoint. If you're backing up SharePoint 2003, when you select the SharePoint server, you'll see the configuration database, and then you'll see the other databases that are associated with SharePoint. Selecting this at the highest level possible is recommended. This allows Backup Exec to do dynamic inclusion, and if any new pieces are added, they'll automatically be added to the backup job as well. So SharePoint 2007 has the databases split out more. You can see more. Here we see the single sign-on database. And you can see also that you have several SharePoint pieces, web applications, that have been deselected in this particular backup scenario. So if they've been retired or they're full, if you have content areas that's full that you've backed up several times, you wouldn't need to back that up repeatedly. This is also a good example of the dynamic inclusion where we have selected it at the highest level but excluded pieces underneath rather than selecting the pieces that you want to be backed up. So if you select it at the highest level, it will automatically pick up new pieces. SharePoint 2010 gives you even more granular resources to back up and restore. Here you see it all expanded. You see the configuration database. You see several different web services. You'll see the shared services. If you scroll down this list, there are even more pieces of SharePoint 2010 available. So this is zooming in for you on the shared services to show you all the services that SharePoint needs to be backed up to recover it effectively. You should also back up the master, model, and MSDB databases. Those are not part of SharePoint, and traditionally those would not be backed up using the SharePoint agent. You should have a SQL agent for Backup Exec in order to back up these databases. But you could not recover the SQL server in a disaster recovery situation without backing up these databases. So these are important databases to back up. You'll notice here that the SharePoint databases are excluded when we tell it to back up SQL in this particular screenshot, and that is because we were backing up those databases using the SharePoint agent. So the Backup Exec agents are smart enough to know which databases belong to SharePoint and which databases need to be backed up with SQL, so you're not backing up the database twice and truncating transaction logs inappropriately. You have several options for backing up SharePoint. By default, when you install the agent for SharePoint, granular recovery will be turned on. So when you back up SharePoint, we will catalog everything in the SharePoint databases and allow you to restore individual blogs, individual wiki pages, individual documents, and in some cases individual databases, but it depends on the database. You can also perform consistency checks against the databases. This is a best practice, and you can, if you tick that checkbox, then the continue if the backup fails becomes active. In the backup definition for SharePoint, it will show you that you have selected the entire server farm, and it will give you a high-level overview of your resources, and then you can add whatever schedules you want to. A full backup is the longest backup. It's the fastest restore. If you choose to add incremental or differentials, those will be done at a block level. Best practices for SharePoint are that you should do a full and differential backups to support disaster recovery. SharePoint is one of the more difficult disaster recoveries, so the longer backups are going to be the easier recoveries. So if you have time to do fulls every night, that would be best. If time is short, the next best practice would be to use differentials. It's very important that you maintain accurate records of patches and hotfixes for SharePoint. And any time that you patch or hotfix SharePoint itself, you should run another full backup that is simplified disaster recovery compatible, so that if you had to bring that server back, you would have a simplified disaster recovery to bring that to the current patch level that's in your environment. You do need to maintain accurate records though. Restoring older versions of SharePoint databases into patched or newer versions of SharePoint can be problematic on a good day. You make sure that the recovery model for the SQL databases is set to simple, and Backup Exec will send you an error message if it's not set to simple. Let's take a look at restoring SharePoint. You can restore any of the portal sites, any of their databases, any of the site services, sub-site components. We'll take a look at the sub-site components and the rules for that in just a moment. You can also restore configuration databases and the single sign-on databases. The configuration databases and the single sign-on databases do not allow you to redirect. They can only be restored to their original location. You need to make sure that if you're restoring the configuration database or the admin content database, that your SharePoint environment is down. It should not be a hot, live, operational SharePoint environment. You should restrict user access to do these restores. If you have to restore either the configuration database or the admin content database, when SharePoint is operational, then you should not have any other restores going. That should be the only restore. Restart the SharePoint services, and then you can restore other SharePoint data. The best practice for doing this restore is to do it when it's non-operational, but the even better practice would be to do a simplified disaster recovery. Other restore considerations that you really should restore all the SharePoint service provider components together so that they're synchronized. If you have to restore the web application, all the content and structure will be overwritten and should be restored all in one piece. You can redirect the web application to a different server. In SharePoint 2003, the IIS website must exist prior to the restore, and the same database structure must exist. You can restore individual documents to a file path, so you can redirect individual documents anywhere you need them to go. To restore SharePoint, you'll go to the Backup and Restore tab and choose Restore. When the wizard comes up, you'll select Microsoft SharePoint Server Data, and then you can choose which pieces of SharePoint you wish to restore. In this example, we're going to go through individual items. So to restore individual SharePoint items, you would drill down, and the backup will allow you to look at the point in time and drill down to the level of a specific file if you needed to. If you want to restore the web applications, it does not allow you to drill down. It shows you the web pieces as a whole because they have to be restored synchronized. If you wish to restore the farm or service components, what you see on the restore screen will be limited to what can be restored as individual pieces or the pieces that must be restored together. So Backup Exec has some intelligence built into it to help you restore SharePoint in such a way that it will always be operational. In SharePoint 2007 is the first time we see the configuration database, so you can restore it. And you'll notice here that the shared services are grouped together. For SharePoint 2010, just like we saw on the backup side, you have incredibly granular level of restore capabilities. The best practice is always to restore at the highest level possible, especially when we're looking at some of the databases. And keep in mind that the configuration database and the administrator's database cannot be redirected. There are more granular selections for SharePoint 2010. You can drill down to a specific document level. SharePoint also does version control of documents. So if I were to check a document out of SharePoint and edit it and then check it back in, SharePoint keeps track of the versioning. Backup Exec supports that and allows you to select specific versions of the documents that you wish to restore. So not only can you restore individual files, but you can restore specific versions of those individual files. Best practice on the databases and the services is always to restore at the highest level you can, but for documents you can drill down to anything you need. You can redirect some of the pieces of SharePoint. The default is it wants to restore everything to the same path from which it was backed up. If you want to redirect to a site, then you need to specify the IIS server that's servicing the entire farm. So the best practice here would be to choose the front-end web server. If you wish to restore to a path, that would be for specific files. You can't restore the databases or the services to a path. Those have to be restored to a SharePoint farm or site collection. For the web applications, you can choose the date and timestamp that you wish to restore. However, Backup Exec will allow you to only restore the entire web portion, the entire content database. If you have multiple databases, you can restore those if it has a second database. And then you can restore any of the higher level pieces. Some of the higher level pieces can be restored into yet a higher level, and we'll take a look at that here in a moment. The services, you cannot select individually. Backup Exec enforces SharePoint best practices that the service components all be restored at the same time. So if SharePoint does not allow you to do granular restores, Backup Exec does not allow you to either. We do enforce Microsoft best practices. When you redirect, it will ask you if you want to restore over an existing database. If you're redirecting SharePoint databases, then the databases have to exist, but they do not have to have content in them. So if you ask, if it asks you about that, you probably do want to overwrite because they do have to exist in order to do this restore. If you're going to redirect to a different location, you need to provide the server farm, and SharePoint must already be installed in that location. You have to restore to an existing infrastructure, even if that infrastructure is blank. So all I'm restoring here is data, but SharePoint has to be installed in the location where you're redirecting. Cross-site restores allow you to restore a lower level topology into a higher level topology, but not vice versa. So I can restore a sub-site to a site collection, but not the other way around. So this slide shows you the limitations. These are Microsoft best practices, and again, Backup Exec simply enforces those best practices. The easiest restores for SharePoint are simply to restore it as it existed at the time of the backup. So in this lesson, we've talked about the purpose and the function of the agent for Microsoft SharePoint. We've talked about the requirements for the agent, and we've discussed how to back up and restore SharePoint Server 2003, SharePoint Server 2007, and SharePoint Server 2010.